All right, welcome back to Energy 101. Today we have Bob Barba, and we are going to talk about refracts, which is refracturing. We already had a whole episode on fracking, so I guess it would help to watch that episode first as we get into like a more detailed industry. But we have the perfect man for the job. He's got so much experience, almost 50 years of basically knowing what's in the ground and how to get it out. And I don't think there's any other better candidate than Bob. So
thank you.
You know, why don't you kind of just talk about fracking in general? Just kind of explain, like I'm 5 years old, just a simple term. Everyone kind of understands drilling, oil, gas, it's in the ground, but and then we can go into refracking from there.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the fracking or hydraulic fracturing, I guess is a technical term for it, is basically what you're doing is you're taking most of the time a relatively low permeability or low inflow reservoir that doesn't really produce much on its own naturally. I mean, the days of drilling a hole in the ground or Jed Clampett shooting a bullet and having a gusher in his backyard, those are long gone. You have to stimulate a well typically when you do it now. And what happens is if you've got a very low inflow reservoir, and you've got, say, a gas molecule that's 500 feet away from you, you drill a well and then you open it up and don't frack it. It might take 3 or 4 years for that gas molecule to get to the wellbore. It's going to travel at a really slow rate and get there. But what if you do with the hydraulic fracture, what you're doing is put a conductive pathway out into the rock where the technical term is extending the wellbore radius, but you're basically drilling a very narrow horizontal well with this frac that's very narrow and very tall and conductive. So it's basically the same as a horizontal well. It's the same concept as drilling a horizontal well, although you're drilling a very thin crack that goes out. And then the gas molecules and oil molecules can flow into that fracture and then come to the wellbore. So now all they have to do is go travel that orders of feet or yards or whatever to that crack, and then they can be transported back to the reservoir in a higher conductivity. You've got very high permeability fractures in there that create that. So you're basically reaching out and touching the hydrocarbons that would normally, they would still come to the reservoir eventually, to the well eventually, but it just takes a long period of time.
Yeah.
Organic shales, like an organic shale, it takes 100 days for a gas molecule to move 1 meter in 100 nanodarcy rock. So that's how fast the hydrocarbons move in the shales that are the most activity right now in the industry. So but with the hydraulic fracture though, it doesn't have to move that far. You only want to move that 1 meter instead of hundreds of meters.
So it speeds up the process.
I've never heard it explained in that way. Like it was a very simple way, but just literally that it's right there in arm's reach, but the fracking really helps.
You're touching it, yeah. You're reaching out and you're increasing the flowing surface area of the reservoir, basically, because it takes forever to produce out of just the normal wellbore, an 8-inch wellbore. But when you extend that wellbore radius out with fractures, you basically, it gets it easier for the hydrocarbons to reach the wellbore.
Like a spider web.
Yeah, so now we get into refracking. And so I think from a layman's stance, you're like, okay, we go in a hole, we drill oil, we get it all out, but we're not getting it all out, hence why we can go back and refrack. And, you can kind of introduce us into that. Back in December, we had you on and we did an AMA on our platform Collide. And there were a lot of people in there and they were excited to have you on and explain this all. And they asked a lot of technical questions. So if you're already up to par, you can watch that. But we're here to really learn from a beginner stance. But why were all these people excited to hear you talk about refracking? Like, what is it? It doesn't sound that interesting. It's like, oh, I go back in there and I get more. It's like,
I just do it again.
Like, is this a new thing? Like, what is going on? Why are people lining up at the door to hear you talk about this stuff?
In organic shales is where it really started taking off as far as having capital investment from operators. The refracts have been around for a while, actually there's two different types of what you might call a refrac. One is a true refracturing treatment where you have existing perforations, existing holes in the rock that you have been producing for a number of years, and basically you repump back into those perfs into the same reservoir. In fact, BKV is doing that in the Barnett. They've done almost 400 of them right so far. They're called bullhead refracts, or we call them pump and pray, or you're basically pumping a bunch of stuff down in a hole without any real focus. It's just going in and you're plugging off perfs as you go with little diverter balls or they've got these little, I call them cat toys. They're little rope, looks like twisted rope. A lot of angry cats on the surface when you do these jobs, because their toys are being pumped down hole, but little rope things they'll pump down there. But they're trying to cut the flow off to the ones that have already taken fluid and force it into other ones like that. That is a refrac treatment. That's a refracturing treatment. You're actually redoing an initial frac job. Now, the other side, which most of the activity is not really refracs, it's more recompletions. You're going back in and mechanically isolating with a steel casing or some kind of steel liner. You're running a brand new casing string into the wellbore, cementing it in place, and then going back in and shooting perforations where there was basically no perforations before. The initial wells in the Eagle Ford Shale, for instance, had these take points or clusters called perforation take points 130 feet apart. Okay, and they went down to maybe 100, and it wasn't. And they started doing this back in 2007, 2008. By 2014 or so, 15, they were down to like 40 or 50 feet on there. Well, ConocoPhillips was kind of the pioneer in this. They went and did one of their Eagle Ford wells down in DeWitt County. They got the bright idea to take a 2014 completion, and then they twinned it with a horizontal well with just a pressure monitor in it. All they did was they went 70 feet away, paralleled the existing wellbore, and measured the reservoir pressure along this pressure array. And they were on 50-foot cluster spacing, which was typical for 2014. What they found was that 85% of that rock in that cluster spacing interval was undrained. It was completely virgin pressure, brand new. They were only draining 15% of that rock. And it's no coincidence that shortly after that, people started going down below 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. And it's also no coincidence that they're the leading refrac or recompletion operator in the Eagle Ford right now. They got the secret sauce early on. They realized in 2016 that they were only draining a part of that reservoir. They were not draining the entire reservoir. The whole industry had never done this. Nobody had ever done this before. In fact, I actually suggested it to Statoil when I was working on their project several years earlier. They go, "Oh no, it's too expensive to drill another well. We're just going to keep drilling these $6 million wells." And I says, "Well, aren't you a little concerned about what they're doing and what they're draining?" "Oh no, wait, they're working." Because basically the wells were working better than the vertical wells. So the initial point of reference for the horizontal wells where they were doing these fracs was vertical. So you might have a vertical Bone Springs well in New Mexico that comes in at 100 barrels a day or 150 barrels a day. They were drilling these horizontal wells and getting 1,000 barrels a day. And wow, we had a home run. Yeah, so the point of reference was not, they didn't raise the bar that high to start with. So there really wasn't much attention given to what's actually going on out there. But Conoco gets credit for taking the initiative to actually measure the pressure. They said, "Whoa, time out. Something's not right." So immediately after that, they went to 7.5 foot cluster spacing for a few wells. And they tried that, and it really didn't. Basically, if you go from 15 to 7.5, you got to double the number of clusters because you only.
What are clusters?
A cluster is where you basically perforate a hole in the pipe, and that's where the fluid and proppant goes.
Got it.
You don't want to put them too close because then they're getting the same hydrocarbons or. Right.
Well, that's a problem that's a problem now on a different level. But yeah. You typically 15 foot is your standard cluster spacing now in most of these new wells, and then 25 to 30 on your.
Is it on both sides? Like force? Is it on every side?
Well, the best efficiency as far as trying to make sure all of your clusters get treated. The big thing about your engineering is you want to have high cluster efficiency. You want to have all of your clusters taking fluid. Some of the early completions, and you compound some of these early wells that had 100-foot cluster spacing, they weren't doing anything to try and ensure they had even flow. They would have like 3 to 5 clusters, and they would not do any kind of special things to make sure they had good coverage. And so statistically, you're only getting about half your clusters open to start with. So in order to have high cluster efficiency, what we found is the best perforation scheme for a horizontal well is maybe 1 hole or maybe 2 holes per cluster. 1 is ideal, but 2 gives you a little better proppant distribution. But it's ideal just 1 hole at the very top of the formation, top of the pipe.
Okay.
And then, but basically, and then go from there. But they found that they could go to 15 feet, and most of your new wells have got 15 foot to 20 foot cluster spacing. And your refracts, you want to go farther apart because they have some other issues there we can talk about later.
So when you refrac, you already have those clusters, and so you're refracking at a different spacing in between.
Well, no, you seal them off. You basically shut the entire production stream off. So one of the things that operators sometimes have a problem with, if you've got a relatively new well that has a high producing value, that you write those reserves off as soon as you run this, you set this job up. So you basically have to. That's a major problem in some areas like the Marcellus Shale, where you've got a lot of what they call sorbed gas. Some of the Marcellus Shale decline curves are almost a straight line. I mean, because over time, the gas starts coming off the kerogen. So you can have wells that were 12, 13 years old that have a present value of like $2 million, now they're refrac candidates. You could probably make it worth $4 or $5 million, but, you're not taking that well offline.
Yeah.
Those investors will have,
So how do they decide like when to do it?
In most areas, in areas that the Marcellus is kind of an exception. In South Texas, some of the gas there is similar to that, where you have a lot of what they call sorbed gas that makes your reserves hard to, it makes refracs hard because they're so strong economically over time that, it's hard to justify taking $1 million write-off, even if you're going to get 3 or 4 million out of it. But most of the time you're down. Your recovery factors on these gas condensate wells should be about 65% with a proper close cluster spacing completion. And the average recovery factor from the pre-2017 wells is about 13%. Oil window, your average recovery factors are around 4 to 5% typically from that vintage. Your total is going to be around 14 when you get done. So you're basically capturing that delta in recovery factor between the current recovery and that 14%.
Okay.
So that's where the prize is. The prize is in what's stranded there. Because people early on didn't realize what Conoco found out on that pilot was that you're not draining a lot. Well, and I've always had a hard time with, we've known for a long time that it takes 100 days for a gas molecule to, that rule of thumb has been around since day one. And yet people still put their clusters 100 feet apart. Okay, well, where do you think these fracks are going? Yeah. I mean, I was there. I was part of that initial deal, and I had a lot of questions. I kept asking Statoil management, don't you guys want to know what these look like out in the far field? It's maybe for $1 million or $2 million you can drill a well, and they were spending like $50-60 million a month drilling these wells, with $6 million a pop, and they had 4 or 5, 6 rigs running. They were just spend, and they were at 90-foot cluster spacing on these initial wells in the Marcellus. So there's a lot of refrac candidates up there now that I guess Chesapeake's got them now, or expand. Yeah.
Is it risky economically to refrac?
Versus,
or do you pretty much know like it's there, like you can tell like I'm going to get this much recovery if we do refrac? Like
it's risky if you don't do your homework. If you go out there and just kind of hope for the best and just use rules of thumb on it's an old well, let's do it. But if you do the proper characterization, which is kind of what we specialize in, shameless plug for what our stuff we do, basically go out and basically look at what was in the ground originally. The key part of a refrac or recompletion is what was in the ground to start with. And the only way you're going to get that's with petrophysics and an integrated study, where you're actually measuring the porosity, the pore volume of the rock, you're measuring the water saturation, you're measuring the net pay thickness, doing some calculations to kind of turn that into what's the oil in place or gas in place. And if you know how much of that you've got out, and then you know how much you can get out with the proper recompletion treatment, then that delta is going to be your upside. If you know that delta, the risk of getting a poor candidate is very low. Now, there's always mechanical risk. I mean, you can always, there's nothing is risk-free out there. But the risk profile for a refracturing or recompletion treatment is really no different, and probably even a little bit lower than a new well, because you've already got the wellbore there. A new well, you don't even know if you can get it. You haven't got it to TD yet. It's not on the ground yet. You still got to get it out there, put the pipe in and all that. There's some risk involved in that. Granted, 1 in 1,000 wells have problems, but still it's not zero, So there is a risk profile, but it's really not any more risk than you have on a new well. Now the difference in there's actual risk and there's perceived risk. I mean, if you're not really comfortable with the whole process of how the recompletions work, and you don't understand the physics, you don't understand a lot of the mechanics of it, you can perceive there's a lot more risk in that because people are doing a lot more new wells than they are refracs. So there's a perception of risk, but it's really not warranted by the actual statistics in the field that are out there.
What is the process of like you figuring out what's downhole? Like, what does that process look like of kind of analyzing that well?
Well, like in the Eagle Ford, for instance, we've analyzed probably 600 open hole logs where we can, where you can measure. You have to have what's called a triple combo. You have to have a density neutron and a gamma ray and a resistivity log. So your basic open hole logs. You don't need anything fancy. And there's a lot of other options to run for logs. That's usually the basic stuff. And you're estimating what the porosity is. You've got a lot of core data from before where you know what your water volume is, what your gas volume, oil volume is. You can estimate what's in the ground from the petrophysical analysis, from the log analysis. And then normally what I'll do is I'll do every one that's available. And ideally, you can map that if you want. I've done that with several operators where you map the numbers. Or if you've got four wells around your refrac well and they all are X barrels in place, well, it's probably X divided by whatever. You bracket the wells. That's ideal, where you see that you've got it covered, because it does change.
Yeah.
You got all the information from the last leaseholders or whatever, right? Like they did seismic, they did wireline, coring, whatever. Then they went down there and they got everything they wanted. You get all of that information from them, or you're purchasing it from them?
Well, we're just using, mostly it's public data. Mostly you're using public open hole log data that's acquired. That's most of it. Seismic's really not too, I mean, it's important to know where your faults are and all that, and it'd be good to have that. But if you don't have that, it's still not going to, the seismic is mostly for trying to determine what your compartment. You see one well it's going to make 100,000 barrels, and you got one next to it that's 50,000 barrels. There's probably a fault there in between there. So it'd be good to know where that fault is when you're designing your job. But other than that, you really don't need anything but the petrophysics. And in reservoir properties, you have to know there's formulas for how much is in the ground versus how much is coming out. It's called volume factors. You have to know those, and those are constantly changing in Eagle Ford. You go from dry gas all the way up to heavy oil. So it's got a huge spectrum, and it changes mile by mile. So you have to estimate that volume factor pretty much almost on a well by well basis. It changes so rapidly.
Yeah, I feel like there's some kind of paradox where the newer the wells are that you're refracking, the more information you have. But if you go to older wells, there's a good chance they didn't get as much hydrocarbons out as they could have because of technology, and maybe it wasn't even fracked originally. So what is the sweet spot? What years literally are you aiming for? If a well is too old, you're that's too risky, it's too new, it's not worth it.
It's more of a too recent. The more recent the well is, the harder it is to recomplete it. For two reasons. One is for the original, we were talking about the current value of the well. And more recent wells typically have a much higher present value. They're much harder to take offline without causing angst among the investors and working interest owners. In fact, we did one in West Texas. We had a study. Well, we didn't do it. I was involved. One of the other operators out there was involved with it, where Conoco had drilled a well in 2018, and it was right on the lease line. They were going to put 6 wells in the section right next to it. And what we've seen is if you don't recomplete or that old well, even if it's 2018 is fairly recent, but it's depleted way down, as long as if it's below original reservoir pressure, what happens is you cause a lot of mechanical problems on the closer wells in that pad. You can actually have your frack be asymmetric, where you have your entire frack job can go towards that depleted well, and the distal side is completely undrained. So they were stuck because they couldn't refrack it. Not just because Conoco was the operator and they weren't the operator; they were an independent out of Midland. But one of the big problems was that your clusters were about 15 to 20 feet apart, and when you do a completion treatment or even a new completion treatment, I hope this is not getting too much in the weeds, but yeah, you basically will have your fracture initiates longitudinally along the wellbore. It's not really well understood. No matter where your holes are, your fracture initiates on the top of the wellbore. And it basically initiates this way, and then once it gets out past the near wellbore, it flips and goes in whatever direction the maximum stress is. Eagle Ford, it's more the northwest, south, the east, depending on where you are. It kind of follows the coast, perpendicular to the coastline. So, but basically those longitudinal fractures are about 10 feet long. So if you have a 15-foot cluster spacing on a horizontal recompletion well on a recomp, you don't have isolation. You're actually in the old perforation, even though you're cemented and you've got isolation in around the wellbore. That longitudinal fractures and we're seeing a lot of that now, where people have kind of overshot. The original problem with Refracs was 130 to 100 foot spacing back in 2009 and 10, 11, like that. And that kind of ratcheted down. In 2016, there was a step change. It's almost like the bat signal went out. I mean, because Conoco did the one research, and I don't even think they published it then, but they started changing their stuff right away. And I guess everybody was looking at Conoco and saying, well, let's do what Conoco's doing. For whatever reason, around July of 16, which is about the time they came up with their study, all of a sudden, everybody went from 50-foot cluster spacing down to 30-foot cluster spacing, like the entire industry, everywhere. I mean, it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, because most of the time it takes forever for stuff like that to change. It was like, boom. So if you say July of 16, anything before that's probably 45, 50 feet or more. After that, it's probably, much tighter than that. So
would you consider that the refrac revolution?
That was the eye opening. Yeah, that was a moment of awareness.
Because there's like the shale revolution was like 2008 or whatever, 2009. And then it sounds like you reference like 2016, 2017 era a lot. So it seems to be like that kind of turning point.
That's when, 2017 was the first, actually there's a paper published in 2009 on vertical well refracts. I'm very familiar with this since I wrote it, but basically I've done a lot of work with I've done a lot of work with rock mechanics and fracturing. And what I was seeing in these vertical wells was you would see 3 and 4 zones in a vertical well that were completed all together. Operators tended to take shortcuts with fracks then either. Like ideally you want to have a separate frack on a vertical well in each zone. Okay, well, they were putting 3 and 4 zones together, and we started doing a lot of diagnostics on those wells and found out that only one of those 3 or 4 sands were producing. The rest of them had just been lightly stimulated. So what we recommended back then was running mechanical liners in there, casing behind there, and doing a brand new completion was in 2009. Now, they didn't start doing it in the shales until 2017. Halliburton was involved with Chesapeake, I think, on some of theirs, or Wild Horse. On some of their work, they did QEP. Some of the other operators in the Haynesville did it. They started doing this mechanical isolation with cementing 3.5 or 4 inch flush joint casing inside there and doing mechanical isolation. That happened about the same time, because before then people were doing primarily bullheads, which are pump and praise. And a typical bullhead treatment on an organic shale, I had an article in Oil and Gas Investor a couple of years ago where we had a case study on this where basically they had a well that was going to make about 95,000 barrels over in the Eagle Ford, a 2014 well. This was 2016. They went in and did a bullhead treatment on it where they basically did a pump and pray, and they increased the EUR, estimated ultimate recovery of the well, to about 130,000 barrels. So the recovery factor went from about 2.5 to 3.4%. Okay, with that bullhead. Then they turned around 2 years later in 2018 and did a liner refrac. They did a mechanical isolation, and they increased the total recovery to about 460,000 barrels, and the recovery factor to 14%. So that's the difference between mechanical isolation and that's.
Wait, what is the process of that? Of mechanical isolation?
You have to go in and make sure the wellbore's cleaned out. You don't want any junk in there because you're going to be sticking a pipe in there with a very tight clearance in there. Your new pipe goes in there. And you can either do what they call an expandable liner, which is probably the most efficient way, where it goes in. You run this pipe in the hole, and then you pull a mandrel through there, and it actually expands it out like a python swallowing a pig. You can see it. The videos.
Colin used to do that. He used to run that.
Okay. Yeah.
He ran expandable casing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The expandable pipe. That's the way to do it. Now, unfortunately, most people don't use that. There's a lot of reasons we won't get into, but it's mostly goofy. Mostly mostly the FOFU factor.
Is it really expensive too?
Also expensive, huh?
Not really, not so much. It is and it isn't. It costs to put a mechanically isolated, say you've got a 5,200 foot liner, which is your average median length for a horizontal refrac in the Eagle Ford shale. Because most of your new wells now are 10,000, 15,000 feet. Back then, before 2017, about 5,000. 5,000 foot lateral, basically with a cemented liner, which you'll put 4 inch flush joint, which basically means you don't have any collars on there. So just a smooth outside, 4 inches in diameter. You slide that inside the 4.8 inch, whatever ID of the 5.5 inch. Slide that in there, then you cement that. Well, the expandable liner goes in there and it comes out and it expands internally on that. But the 4 inch flush joint would be about $350,000 for that, and then the expandable is about $500,000. But with the expandable though, you can have more clusters because you can pump at higher rates, and more rate means you can have more clusters. You have so many barrels a minute per cluster that you have to pump, like 6 to 8 usually, your minimum. So if you add another 10 barrels a minute or 15 barrels a minute of that pump rate with the expandable, you can actually add 2 more clusters. So you cut your stage count down by a quarter with the expandable. So it costs more up front, but it's a pay me now, pay me later type thing. So it's you pick your poison. You actually come out ahead with the expandable financially. It's cheaper to frack a well with an expandable than it is with cemented, with the all-in cost at the end of the day. But it's people don't want to try it. They got the foo factor.
Foo.
Fear of fouling up, I think. Yeah.
Let me get back on like just starting level. So what percent of like hydrocarbons are we getting out of a well? Like it's not 100%. So what is it before the refrac?
A typical oil well, say in the Eagle Ford or Permian, with wide cluster spacing early in the play, is typically 3 to 5% of the oil in place is recoverable, and then with a properly executed recompletion treatment, it can be as high as 14 to 15. 14 in your shales and 15 like in your Bone Springs and your if it has matrix permeability, which again. These organic shales are about 100 nanodarcies, but yet whereas a Wolfcamp well in West Texas or let's say Bone Springs, a Bone Springs well is like 20,000 nanodarcies. It's 0.02 millidarcies, but it's 20,000 nanodarcies. So a 20,000 nanodarcy rock is going to actually drain part of the rock outside of the fracture, whereas your organic shales are only going to drain about 10 feet at the most, plus or minus, whereas you drain a lot wider. Some of these wells, like the Bone Springs in New Mexico and Joe Mill and things like that, were actually being drilled on 20 to 40 acre spacing vertically, economically. So it can get the oil and gas in the ground without having to have a lot of stages. So that one you can probably get 15% with a refrac, whereas you only get about 14 because you can't get your clusters close enough together to get that full 15. You still got gaps even with the really tight cluster spacing now.
So 15 is like a great number, right?
For oil, yeah.
From someone who doesn't understand anything, you're like, well, why is it 100%? Like, can you explain to me why don't you suck 100% of the hydrocarbons out of the ground?
Well, it mostly capillary forces, and the force of the binding the fluids to the rock. And why it's the same everywhere. I've always wondered about this. It seems like no matter where I go in the world, if it's a solution gas drive reservoir, it's basically, which is the most common type of reservoir out there. You're looking at about a 15% recovery factor, and that doesn't really change that much. It's weird. You think that high and low perm would have different, but really, I haven't seen that much difference. Theoretically, your higher perms can have higher numbers, but that's kind of the thing. And then you can increase that with, I say, a water flood, or if you have what's called a water drive, if you have water below you're just actually driving your hydrocarbons, those are about 30%.
Oh, wow.
And if you do something like EOR with a CO2 or something like that, or some kind of miscible gas top, you can get it up to higher than that. And so that you can improve it, and the most efficient is like what they call fire flood. We actually combust downhole, and you can get close to 100% there. But you're probably looking at maybe a maximum of 50 to 60% with enhanced oil recovery and all that. But you got to do something other than just producing the well. You have to start actually changing the drive mechanism or changing the fluids in situ to be able to get more than that.
Yeah, it's obviously more nuanced than that, but just thinking from a layman's term, like, we're all just picturing like a balloon underground and you suck it out like a straw, and it's like literally it's not like that at all. But yeah, I mean, is there a future of like getting a higher percentage with refracking, or is this kind of like your peak?
I would feel like that's always the goal.
Well, the big 800-pound gorilla now in terms of going forward to these wells like that Conoco well I talked about in the Delaware Basin, where you've got, after 2017, the good news is that your clusters are closer together and you're getting higher recovery factors. Well, the bad news is that your clusters are closer together and they're hard to frack. so really, the only way you're going to be able to stimulate those wells, like going back, if we could redo the deal with the Conoco well and the offset operator, ideally that's a perfect candidate for enhanced oil recovery type stuff, where pumping miscible gas down there or even CO2 or something, because you need something to pressurize that wellbore. And if you use something like a miscible gas or a CO2, you can actually improve your production on that wellbore, because pressure is pressure. It doesn't really matter where the pressure comes from. Traditionally, you want to refract that with a fluid-based frac and just put it in the zipper pattern. You've got 5 wells, now you got 6 wells. You just add that well to your zipper and do it, sequentially. I'm sure everybody's familiar with zippers. Basically you do one at a time, and this is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. So that ideal, but I think you're going to have a lot of opportunities where a lot of these wells, in fact, some of the best refrac candidates we've seen are these newer wells that had poor completions. We did a big study in one field over on the Eagle Ford where we had brand new wells that had 15 to 18 foot cluster spacing in the wellbore that basically used diverter pods alone. They didn't try to do what they call extreme limited entry. Your extreme limited entry is when you have a lot higher pressure in the wellbore than you do in the formation, usually 2,000 to 2,500 pounds. If you generate about a 2,500 pound pressure drop between the wellbore and the formation, again, by limiting the number of holes and increasing the rate, it's a function of rate and number of holes, you can get 100% of your clusters open. Well, if you don't do that, these guys only did 200 pounds instead of 2,000 pounds. They had only half their perfs open. Their recovery factor was 7.5% on a brand new wells. Now, the offset, we had 5 refracts in that field. They averaged 13.5%. Because what happens is when you draw your reservoir pressure down in a reservoir, your frac will propagate in the maximum stress direction because you've got a maximum minimum stress direction at all times. One's higher than the other. In the Eagle Ford, it's very low contrast because it's all normal faults that are moving away from each other. What you get is when you start draining that maximum stress direction where the frac went to start with, it's kind of hard to get your arms around because usually things don't go to the path of highest resistance, the path of least resistance. When you initiate a fracture with fluid, you pump fluid into the rock, it opens to the minimum stress direction. And the maximum stress direction just happens to be 90 degrees to that. That's the only reason. It doesn't go into you're not fighting uphill, the stuff rolls downhill, rule of thumb works there too,
Yeah.
But so basically the upshot of that is you've now depleted that along that fracture. So that is now lower, and you only have to lower your reservoir pressure by, say, 1,000 pounds or so, and all of a sudden your maximum minimum stress directions flip. So you can actually get, instead of a planar fracture, which is what you're getting on a new well, you get more of a shotgun. Like in the Barnett, when they first started doing microseismic at the Barnett early on, Barnett is basically isotropic. The stresses are balanced. There really is no preferred direction. When they would do the slickwater jobs, they would see 2,000 foot wide fracks from a vertical well. Going out 2,000 feet, just this huge pattern. I think that's what you're seeing in the Eagle Ford when you have this pressure depletion. But the new wells, that in this comparison, they were only getting 7.5% of the oil in the ground because they didn't use proper diversion techniques. So,
yeah. Speaking of candidates and these basins, like you're saying, it sounds like the Marcellus and the Eagle Ford are the best basins to refrac in.
Pretty much anywhere where you've got restrained hydrocarbons is really good. Bakken's big. The Permian is the 800-pound gorilla. People have been asking me for years, why are people not refracking in the Permian?
Are they not?
Well, not at any kind of scale. It's kind of hit or miss, and the reason they're not doing it is because they're not doing it. It's the faux.
Have you talked to people from there, and they just they're just like, I'm trying, but I can't.
I've had more people in my refrac schools from the Permian than anywhere else. Everybody keeps talking about it, but like that one particular case study we talked about with that operator, that not being able to frack that Conoco well cost the operator 1 million barrels of hydrocarbons just from the mechanical aspects. Because what happened was you had 6 wells there, 6 slots on the well. They were going to use 880 spacing. There were 6 wells on that section, and the Conoco well was right on the lease line in the next section over. They decided instead of putting a well right next to the Conoco, they would skip a location. So they moved a pad. They only put 5 wells in there instead of 6. Okay. Well, these are 70 barrels per lateral foot estimated ultimate recovery wells. So a 10,000 foot lateral is going to make 700,000 barrels of oil. They just subtracted 700,000 barrels from their recoverable hydrocarbons by doing that, by not drilling that well. Okay. So the next thing was what the next offset, which would have been the second order offset instead of the first order. Now it was the first order, which is the closest one to the Conoco well. It lost 30 barrels a foot because of the asymmetric fracture that went to the Conoco depletion. So basically, not being able to refract that well in the Delaware Basin, which is in the Permian where they don't refract, not being able to refract that well cost them 1 million barrels of production. So it's just for that alone. Even if the refract made 0, which they don't, you have actually about 40 to 50% higher oil in place per well in the Permian than they do in the Eagle Ford on the average. It's got a much bigger target. So it's just a matter of time before people finally figure it out. But
it's so interesting because I feel like everyone's talking about refracking. I didn't know that they weren't doing that.
Not wholesale. I mean, I Permian probably maybe a couple dozen at the most, and I really
That's
haven't kept
so
up with
crazy.
those. You know,
And
Bakken's pretty busy. The Bakken's busy. Eagle Ford's busy. Barnett's huge right now. That's all. There's no new activity in the Barnett. BKV is doing all refracts. They bought the Devon and the ExxonMobil XTO properties.
that's in Oklahoma.
Fort Worth Basin. Yeah,
Okay.
DFW.
Yeah, I mean, what do you know about the same trend, but like internationally or maybe offshore? Is that refracking popular there? Or?
Can you refrac offshore?
Usually when you're fracking a well offshore, you're doing it primarily, they're always high permeability. You want to refract to basically, when you have unconsolidated sands, and you typically would do what they call a gravel pack, where you run in a screen assembly, and then you just pump propping around the outside of it to try and keep the formation from collapsing. Because unconsolidated formations, basically, if you don't have some kind of sand control in there, they will collapse on you and just ruin the well. So what they found back in the early 90s is you could go in and actually do a frack treatments on those too. Then now they're real high concentration, really, I mean, you might go 10, 12, 14 pounds per gallon, and, just, you put a really short, fat frack on those wells. They tend to produce a lot longer. You have fewer sand production problems. It's a lot of times you're in offshore, you'll have these. I did one offshore production log where I had a Darcy permeability on the top, where we tested it, and half a Darcy permeability in the next zone down. We ran a production log past that. They did a natural completion, no frack. All the flow was coming out of the Darcy rock. Half the reservoir wasn't producing.
Oh, wow.
The higher permeability was producing. Well, you did a frack there, you would connect the entire, you would establish vertical permeability. So it's mostly mechanical reasons that you do it offshore. You're not really trying to reach out and touch the hydrocarbons, and you don't, your cluster spacing and all that stuff doesn't really, figure into it. It's a different deal, because those wells will flow without a frack. But so it's probably not really
Very
offshore.
interesting.
Yeah, but land pretty much anywhere, any formation that's got horizontal wells or even vertical wells is a good refract candidate.
If everyone in a Permian isn't like too eager to jump on refracking, then it kind of like helps the debate of like if we're hitting peak oil or not. We're going back in the ground and refracking existing wells. It's like, oh no, there must be running out of room and hydrocarbons and stuff. So like, what is your take on that? Like, are we refracking to like get all the juice out, or is it because there's no other options? Like what's really happening?
It's a huge low hanging fruit in the industry right now. Like the numbers, I did a study in South Texas of about 150 some wells, and looked at the refract potential in the Eagle Ford. And there's about 15,000 total active wells that are refract candidates, and we're now looking at inactive wells, because we just recently, I was involved with the lobbying organization, Texas Independent Producers Royalty Association. We helped sponsor a bill at the state legislature to get a exemption and severance tax for refracts up to a certain period of time if the wells are inactive. So there's an incentive for going back to inactive wells now. We're now looking at a large number of inactive wells. So there's probably maybe 18,000 total wells in that. I took the ones that were out of that group, out of the 15,000, and pulled out the ones that had the best candidates, so the ones that have wider well spacings, you're not stacked on top of each other. And out of that third, I ran the numbers on what would happen if you went ahead and developed these pads. And it came out to about $43 billion in incremental revenue. That's right now sitting in the ground, that's not going to come out. I mean,
It's crazy.
Tier 1 inventory. I mean, everybody's buying the whole thing. Refracts versus buying other companies for inventory. I never understood that, because you're basically just changing pockets with the money. You're not adding any value by buying a company. You're adding inventory, but you're not adding any inventory to the industry. You're adding it to your personal company. You're not really increasing the reserve base. Whereas if you put that money into recompletions, that it makes a lot more sense. You're actually creating wealth instead of just redistributing it. So yeah, we're just scratching the surface, and nobody is really doing where we're pushing now is trying to raise money to do these all legacy well pads. Because right now nobody's doing that. Everybody's going in and they'll do a parent well with child wells around it. That's 99% of the refracts are for that purpose. And it's a good reason. I mean, it's economic, but none of the operators are out there trying to actively exploit these all legacy wells. Like SM made a presentation in ERCOM a couple of weeks ago, and they're showing all this Austin Chalk activity, and you look at their map, and it's like completely covered with Eagle Ford wells. There's no Eagle Ford wells are in their plans, because they've drilled every location they have, and so they're going up to the Chalk and well, what are you doing that for? Why don't you just refract the ones you got? Because you only get that particular area was in our study, and they're averaging about 13% recovery factor out of 65%. So there's a huge amount of gas and oil in the ground.
So when you refrac, how long does it keep producing? Like how
As long as
you
the
don't
original
know?
well, you're
So you
basically
tap out.
well. You got the one thing that's interesting along those lines is we have this your decline curves have a certain coefficient called a B factor, which tells you, and if it's the same reservoir pressure, same hydrocarbons and that, your B factor from the original completion should be the same on the refrac. It's almost always the same.
Okay.
So you're getting an original decline because you're fracking brand new rock. You're fracking the same rock that you got before, but was just missed.
Right.
So if your new wells are producing for 30 years, which is a good number, then your refracs will produce for 30 years more. So you're starting with a brand new reservoir, basically.
That's
so
awesome.
it's starting to clock over. You know, a 20-year-old well that gets refract is going to produce for another 30.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple vocabulary words came up that I'm the guy who edits all the stuff here. So we've had you on a few times and watched your other interviews you've done, and I don't think we covered this. Just basic vocabulary. There's legacy wells and then there's parent-child wells. So can you kind of like sum that up real quick, and then maybe what does it have to do with refracking?
Sure. A legacy well to me is just an old well. I mean, really, and really, ideally, as far as refrac candidates go, it's an old well prior to 2017. It's probably a good cutoff. So any well drilled before 2017, I would call a legacy well. And then most of your activity now is, in fact, some of like the county, Webb County, for instance, down South Texas, where they've almost completely drilled up everything, that's where SM's properties are. There are very few refracs. There's only about 2 or 3 refracs in that entire county because there's no parent-child. I mean, when you put in a new pad of all new wells or all child wells, then you have to protect that child well with a refrac on the parent well that's nearby. So, but if you don't have any new wells going in, which they don't have spaces for, they don't have now Karnes County, DeWitt County, between those two, there's probably 300 refracs. But then you go they go just down into Webb and Dimmitt County down there, almost no refracs at all because nobody's doing parent wells. Almost all the activity now is on the new well pad offset wells, not your legacy wells.
But like really explain the parent-child thing, like, because I'm picturing, I don't even understand what that is. It's like, is a parent well like the first well and the child wells are the ones around it, or?
A parent well is really, I mean, it's kind of I guess there's different terms they throw around for it, but basically a parent well is the original well. Say, for instance, they went out there and when they originally first started developing the Eagle Ford or any of these reservoirs, you would drill one well to hold the lease. And that basically you have to establish production on that lease, and whatever that lease was, 1 section, 2 sections, whatever, you would hold that lease by production. And then, so basically almost all the activity prior to, I don't know when they started doing pad drilling, probably the average number of wells on a pad now from prior to 2017 is 3. So it's between 2 and 4 most of the time, with the P50s around 3 wells per pad. Now the average is more like 6 or 7. Almost all new wells are fully developing those pads. So, but you would originally go out and you establish production in an area, hold the lease, then you come back in later and do the child wells around it. And that's when you have to refrac the parent well when you have the child wells nearby, because that's how they lost that 1 million barrels in the Delaware example.
Why do you have to refrac it? So they don't run into each other, or
right.
what?
Well, if you have you have a pressure sink over here and you have a frack here, well, you've got your reservoir that you're fracking is that wide. But if you have a pressure sink over here and you frack it, you lose half that reservoir. You lose 40% of your recovery on that well. But the first order well loses statistically about 40% of the EUR, and then the second order, it loses about 20%. We've got a couple studies that show that. So and that one there, they moved the first order was now the second order was now the first order when they pulled that well out of the slot, and that one actually lost, looks like 30% or so.
It is so wild to me how technical this industry is, like the engineering that goes, like I find it fascinating, and you're making me want to like go to school and be a petroleum engineer because I find it just fascinating what's going on underground. But
that reminded me the whole parent-child thing we were just talking about. It's like, it's all in one pad, right? And you ever go to a site, it's like they're really wide. There's room for the little like camps and the site and then the storage, whatever. But like on that same pad, they had drilled like just like 100 feet that way. And what I learned is that the drilling pads, they're on hydraulics that can lift up and walk on the pad, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like they can lift up like whatever, like 1 million tons of metal.
I
and
saw
it
a video
walks.
of that recently. It was really cool. The robotics are insane.
You gotta speed it up. It's a very slow walking process.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing. Some of these, they'll drill. I don't know what the record is, but they can drill any number of wells off the same pad. They're going
Well, you said it went from like 3 to like 7, and I'm assuming that technology helped it do that, right?
Probably. Oh yeah. I mean, the advances in technology on drilling side are phenomenal. I mean, the rate of time it takes to drill a well now is like just a fraction of what it used to. I mean, it's
Wrapping up with one more question about refracking, you brought up tapping into inactive wells, and I was kind of wondering, like, is refracking kind of reviving inactive wells? Because what we're ultimately trying to do is make money, make profit, and not, lose money. So is it risky to go into inactive wells, and are you literally reviving them?
Well, you have to run the economics on it pretty much, because what happens is on an oil reservoir, you've got about 660 spacing. You get about 330 foot of drainage on either side. So if you have all wells that are 660 spaced in a field, they're all refrac candidates mechanically, and depending on whether they got enough oil in place or not, But the problem is what the average well spacing in say DeWitt County right now is 347 feet, not 660. So a lot of these shale wells are stacked on top of each other drainage wise. So sometimes if you got your wells too close together, no matter how old they are, no matter how much oil is in the ground, you've already drained a lot of those reservoirs. You've already drained a lot of that. So a lot of these older wells that are not refrac candidates because they're too close together. But assuming they're wide enough apart, longer laterals make better refrac candidates because it's all about oil in place per acre times the number of acres, and it's more acres with more length. And then basically the spacing, the well spacing, the oil in place, and then the length, all three of those go together. And what you do is you combine that and run an economic model on it and see what the present value. Like the operator I'm working with right now, we just got funding to do a bunch of refracs, and they're shooting for like 3.5 to 1 return on that. But a lot of the wells I looked at all weekend, I looked at about 100 of them, and probably 80% of them didn't make that, mainly because their wells are too close together. They're looking at the sweet spot in the Carnes DeWitt area. They've already, the oil in place is so high that they've got their wells too close together. Now it's economic on a pad level because the optimum number of wells for a pad is what maximizes the net present value or the value of that pad. That's not the net present value maximization of each well. You're probably only getting 60% of the maximum NPV on each well, but by having more wells, you actually increase the NPV of the pad. So it's not dumb to go in with more wells in there, but it makes it hard to refrac. So with that caveat, though, virtually every inactive well is worthy of being looked at for a refrac. Technically, it's a candidate, but it may not economically. You may have already recovered if your spacing's too close and all that. Because it costs my formula is about $1.5 million fixed cost plus about $500 a foot for your refrac costs. That typically gets you pretty close to the AFEs. So you have to tack that on there, and it's got to pay that out. Typically about 2.5, 3 to 1 is usually the minimum. So that's the only restriction is the economics on that.
That was a very technical episode we just had just now.
My mind is blown.
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole episode on fracturing. Of course, the dedicated refrac episode is going to go even more in the weeds. But I mean, at least I understand it. I don't think I could show Grandma this to be like, hey, Grandma, this is what refracking is. But that was great. I really enjoyed that. And
it was awesome.
Getting the translated version of what you did with John in December, because that was just a bunch of jargon to me.
That's all your questions.
It is very detailed. So I'm gonna show a clip here just to kind of wrap things up, and I just want to get into more of the state of public interest in fracking, energy, yada yada. I always think that's funny. Maybe farm some good clips out of this. So actually, I shared this video over the weekend.
I knew you were gonna do this.
My girlfriend sent me this, and so it's a DJ who's doing a DJ set, and they're just playing fracking in the background. And, it's probably anti-establishment, they're polluting the planet, whatever. And, that's good. They can do whatever cause they want. But the funny thing about this video is that, what kind of fracking would you call this, Bob?
Blowing up the ground.
Oh.
On the surface.
You get a lot of oil fracking like that?
Well, they used to do nitro fracks back in the 30s and 40s, yeah. But
it's not in black and white; it's colored.
Gonna say, yeah.
So, it's a glaring reminder that people still do not understand what the hell we're doing, what's turning on their lights. We've heard this whole spiel. What is your spiel with the society's energy IQ? And what do they think
Their
of,
view of fracking.
They hate fracking so much. What's going to happen when they hear about refracking and all this? What do you think is the public perception of all this?
Not that you're putting my tinfoil hat on and the helicopters are coming, but
Please do.
The first article that was written about fracking being dangerous was in 2008, and it was written by Gazprom, the Russian gas company. The second article was similar. They took their name off. It was a source provided this. The Gazprom realized after they made that first note that they were exposing their hand.
Yeah.
So they are actively involved. I mean, during Vietnam, the Soviets spent, $1 billion on propaganda to try and undermine our society with the race relations and the whole 9 yards and all this stuff. That was, and their budgets, even though it's now FSB and not KGB. In 1984, one of the Yuri Bezmenov, the Russian colonel, defected and said, "We have a program in place here now. We're not going to beat you militarily. We're going to beat you on the social front. We're going to undermine your society with all this stuff." And they clearly want to undermine our oil and gas business because it's a direct threat to theirs. I mean, we are head-to-head competitors with them. So they initially sponsored openly the first anti-fracking. Nobody had even written bad stories about fracking at all. There were no articles before then about fracking. First article was written by them. All the other articles, if they didn't write them, they should have. If I was over there writing checks for their company, I'd be doing it. I mean, that's in their best interest to put our business out of business. And even the movie Gasland, there's a lot of speculation on where the funding came from that. It's there's a lot of forces out there in the world that are against our industry. And that's really where the root cause of all this came from. There was nothing in the press or nothing in the media prior to that. And it's strangely coincidental that they're spending money on undermining our society. We know that for a fact. Bezmenov documented that. That's a fact. But, if they're not spending it on this, they're stupid. They should be doing it. If I would do that, if I were them, I would definitely be undermining our business. And that's the best way to do it. Because none of this makes any sense. There's no, when I worked on the Chesapeake project with Statoil, we had a meeting up there in Oklahoma City, and they said, "Yeah, we got a suit from one of the offset operators 3 miles away that from our location that their faucet's on fire, and so they blame fracking for that, I was like, okay, well, 3 miles away, no, and also they've been drilling through these shallow gas. There's a lot of shallow gas up there, coal bed methane stuff that they've been producing gas in their water for years. It's been a problem forever. But they somehow got that attributed to the Chesapeake was getting sued by an operator that was miles away from their nearest well that they had on that. None of it makes any sense because none of it's been documented.
Yeah.
None of it's documented to cause any harm.
And I would argue that we care about the safety of the environment and our working space more than anyone else claims. Like, we want our people safe. We don't want to pollute the air. Like, I just think it's crazy.
A lot of the oil and gas produced around the world is produced under horrible environmental conditions and no respect for the environment. China's putting the coal plant out every week now, and yet we're trying to. We'll find an operator if 1 MCF a day comes out of his wellhead. He's going to have a heavy fine from the government. And they're putting stuff in the air willy nilly, and
right.
So and we're going to need oil. And every conference I've been to has the same number. 80% of the world's energy needs are going to be met by hydrocarbons forever. Your demand is going to increase, your solar is going to increase, wind, all these other things are going to increase. But right now, about 80% is going to be from the oil and gas.
Do you think we'll ever run out of oil and gas? Oil?
Well,
Refracs.
It's. I think there's the economics involved. We have probably a 300-year supply of natural gas in North America. Now, to produce that last few MCF, you might have to spend $20 an MCF. But right now, it's most of it's economically. So it's a matter of economics. It's there. It's in the ground. Yeah. Gas more than oil. I think we have a huge supply of natural gas here in North America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can even know how much oil we still have to produce?
Oh, yeah. The stuff I do for Refracs, you do volumetrics. If you know the porosity, the pore volume of the rock, the saturation, the thickness, and all that, you can do volumetric estimates of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they always do it for the headlines. I did the whole video on the Beetaloo in Australia. They're saying there's 300 years of natural gas there, just in the Beetaloo alone. And in that video, I used a clip of Obama saying that we have 100 years of natural gas. And that was back in 2010 or something, during the shale revolution. So they love whipping out those numbers saying like, oh,
Yeah.
we got centuries of gas and oil and it's all we need.
Well, even right now, there are very few rigs running in South Texas in the Eagle Ford gas window. There's almost 0 rigs running in West Texas in the Wolfcamp gas window. The whole western half of Culberson County is all gas, and there's no rigs running there in West Texas and the Delaware. And it's a highly prolific basin with all multiple stack pays. A lot of the gas windows out there, there are very few rigs. There are 0 rigs running in the Barnett. I mean, it might be 1, but I mean, the BKV is doing all refracts. So, I mean, it's like you got a lot of these areas that don't even have gas rigs running right now. Most of the gas coming out of Permian is coming out of associated gas. That's what's filling up the pipelines there. It's not. There are very few dedicated gas wells in the Permian that don't have a significant oil component to it. You know, but yet you're filling up a pipeline every year. They're just they're adding 5.5 BCF of takeaway capability in the Permian right now. Come online next year. Since we operate some wells out there on the Waha system, we're very pleased to see that.
Yeah.
Because right now we can't sell our gas. But it's, we're not even trying half the time on the gas.
Right.
We actually put an effort into it. We could really hit a home run there. And then Marcellus has got a huge supply as well.
Right.
But it's all takeaway constrained because they can't get pipelines in the ground.
Yep.
It's
Save that for another episode.
Yeah.
All right, Bob. Thanks for coming on.
great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is so fun.